All right, strap in, everybody. We're going deep today into some pretty provocative ideas. You know how we usually think of Western societies as like the model for progress and individual freedom? Well, the stuff we're looking at today flips that whole idea on its head.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It suggests that those values, especially the ones around shifting gender roles and feminism, might actually be causing the West to, crumble.
Interesting.
Yeah, and here's the really wild part.
Yeah.
It suggests that Africa, by holding on to more traditional patriarchal structures, could actually hold the key to saving Western civilization.
Wow, that is a complete reversal of the typical narrative, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's really fascinating how this source just challenges all of our assumptions.
Yeah.
About, which societies are truly advanced and which ones are lagging behind.
Right. Like, whoa. Okay, so before we get too far into this, I want to be super clear. We are not here to say whether we agree or disagree with this viewpoint.
Right.
Controversial, for sure. So what we're going to do is we're going to unpack the argument, see what evidence they're using, and help you understand why this is even a conversation people are having.
Yeah, and that's crucial, right? I mean, to analyze these claims with a critical eye. So, for example, they argue that radical feminism is kind that, advocates for complete emancipation from traditional gender roles and the nuclear family is actually weakening the foundations of Western society.
Yeah, and they actually use the legalization of no-fault divorce in the U.S. back in the 1960s as a prime example of this.
Oh, wow.
You've probably heard about the rising divorce rates since then, right?
Yeah.
And the source sees that, along with the increase in single-parent families, as evidence of this societal breakdown.
I see. So they connect this idea to a concept from the sociologist Emile Durkheim called anomie.
Okay.
Think of it like this. Imagine a society where everyone is playing a different game and there are no shared rules.
Okay.
That's kind of what anomie is, like a lack of shared norms and values that, hold society together.
Yeah.
And the source argues that the individualistic focus of radical feminism is kind of pushing us toward this state of anomie, which in their view is a sign of instability.
Okay, yeah. It gets even more complicated when they bring up the idea that some women are attracted to, bad boys as like a potential consequence of blurring those traditional gender roles.
Oh, really? That's an interesting point.
Yeah.
It definitely raises eyebrows.
For sure.
It's one that requires, careful consideration. And while they don't explicitly endorse this behavior, the source presents it as a symptom of this broader societal shift away from clear gender roles, a shift that they believe contributes to instability.
Yeah, and this leads into their argument about leadership and control. They make a bold claim that male control, rooted in biological and psychological differences between men and women, has historically been essential for stability and progress.
Interesting. So to illustrate this point, they offer some pretty hefty historical examples, right?
Yeah.
You've got figures like Julius Caesar, who obviously played a huge role in building the Roman Empire, Napoleon,
right,
and his influence on France, and even Winston Churchill and his leadership during World War II.
Wow, yeah.
These are all, presented as evidence of how effective male leadership can be, especially in times of crisis.
And to really hammer home this idea of male leadership as crucial, they contrast those examples with what they see as the consequences of moving away from
traditional structures.
Okay, yeah. What do they use as examples for that?
Well, one example is one case study they use is the modernization of Japan. They argue that as Japan shifted away from arranged marriages, which they see as a mechanism of social control, primarily led by men, the country actually experienced a decline in social stability. It's almost like they're saying that. But letting go of those, stricter male-dominated systems, things started to fall apart. So it's a very cause and effect kind of argument they're making.
Yeah. No, it's super, super important to remember that. This is just one perspective, and a very controversial one at that.
Right.
There are definitely many other ways to interpret these historical events and societal shifts.
Of course, yeah.
But understanding this particular line of reasoning can be really valuable even if you don't agree with it.
Right. Oh, yeah.
It lets us see the world through a different lens, even if it's one we ultimately reject.
Exactly. It kind of forces us to re-examine our own assumptions.
For sure.
And, maybe even strengthen our own arguments.
Yeah.
So this is where our focus shifts to Africa.
Okay.
The source presents Africa as this stark contrast to the West, where, traditional patriarchal structures remain strong and resistant to what they call radical feminism and gender ideology.
They paint this picture of Africa where men are still seen as the natural leaders, protectors, and decision makers, often holding significant spiritual authority as well.
I see. It's like stepping back in time in a way.
Totally, yeah. To really illustrate this point, they point to the Ashanti kings in Ghana, Zulu chiefs in South Africa, and Maasai leaders in Kenya and Tanzania.
Okay.
These are all examples of societies where men, particularly older men, hold a great deal of power and authority.
Yeah, and here's the kicker, right? They argue that even colonialism, which obviously had a massive impact on governance and other aspects of African life, didn't manage to dismantle these core patriarchal structure.
It's like those structures were so deeply ingrained that they managed to withstand even that kind of upheaval.
Right. Almost like they were immune to it somehow.
Yeah.
They claim that many African nations have actively resisted adopting Western views on gender roles, and that these resistance is a key factor in what they see as Africa's relative stability compared to the West.
So they're setting up this stark contrast, right?
Yeah.
The West supposedly collapsing under the weight of feminist ideals, and Africa standing strong with traditional values intact.
A very black and white picture.
Yeah.
And then they take it a step further by arguing that Africa is now facing a new threat in the form of those very same Western ideologies like radical feminism and what some call wokeness that are being spread by, international organizations, NGOs, activists.
It's almost like they see this as a kind of ideological battle with these external forces trying to impose a Western agenda on Africa, promoting things like gender equality, LGBT rights, and the dismantling of those traditional structures that we were just talking about.
So like a clash of
views.
Yeah. They even use the example of Uganda's 2014 anti-homosexuality law.
Right.
Which, got a lot of international condemnation, but it was actually supported domestically.
Yeah.
As a defense of traditional values.
Right.
It shows just how complex this issue gets when you have these different cultures and values clashing on a global stage.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah, we have.
Exploring the sources' claims about the decline of the West due to radical feminism, contrasted with their view of Africa as this stronghold of traditional values. And we've seen how they link this to the influence of religion and culture.
Picking up where we left off this source, they don't shy away from painting a pretty dramatic picture of what they see as the consequences of, the West embracing feminism and gender equality. They argue that these shifts have led to a decline in social cohesion, a rise in instability. Pretty sweeping claims, wouldn't you say?
Yes, absolutely. They even go so far as to suggest that this could ultimately spell the downfall of Western civilization as we know it. Yeah. It's a pretty bold statement, to put it mildly. I think it's, really important for us to approach this with a critical eye. Because while they, offer up a lot of historical examples and sociological theories to back up their claims, there are definitely other ways to look at these issues. What really stands out to you as we consider their perspective?
Well, one thing that jumps out at me is how they seem to be relying on a very specific interpretation of history and sociology. One that really emphasizes the importance of those traditional hierarchies and gender roles that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, that's a great point. For example, they point to the decline of arranged marriages as a sign of societal decay.
Right.
But arranged marriages have been a point of contention for centuries.
Of course, yeah.
With lots of criticism for how they can limit individual choice and perpetuate power imbalances, particularly for women. It's a really complex issue with a long and nuanced history, and I think their take on it might be oversimplifying things a bit, don't you think?
I agree, yeah. And they also seem to be overlooking all of the benefits that have come from women having more autonomy, participating more fully in society.
Right.
I mean, think about the advancements we've seen in education, in the workforce, in politics.
Totally.
These are huge strides forward that have undoubtedly had a positive impact on the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's important to acknowledge that progress while also recognizing that, there are still challenges we need to tackle. But the source almost seems to be advocating for a return to a past that, for many people, was inherently unequal and unjust.
Yeah, it feels a bit like they're romanticizing a time that wasn't as rosy as they might think.
Totally, totally. Okay, so let's shift our attention now to how the source portrays Africa. They present it as this bastion of traditional values where men are still firmly in control and society is structured along more patriarchal lines. It's a pretty distinct contrast to their view of the West.
It is, yeah. And they seem to view that contrast as a positive thing, right?
Yeah.
Arguing that Africa's resistance to Western ideologies like feminism has helped preserve a sense of social order and stability. But, we have to remember, Africa is a vast and incredibly diverse continent with a huge range of cultures, beliefs, social structures. It's really dangerous to generalize about an entire continent. And it feels like that's what they're doing here.
Yeah, I totally agree. Their portrayal of Africa often feels romanticized and even a bit nostalgic. It's like they're looking back at this pre-colonial past that in reality was also marked by its own set of challenges and inequalities. It's important to acknowledge that.
Absolutely. And they're also kind of downplaying some of the very real issues that exist in many African countries today. Are like poverty, corruption, political instability. These are complex issues with many contributing factors, and it's too simplistic to just blame them on, a decline in traditional values.
Right. Right. Okay, so we've talked about their views on the West and Africa like separately. Now let's dig into their core argument that the decline of Western civilization is directly linked to the rise of feminism and gender fucko, the erosion of those traditional gender roles. They present it as this, like pretty clear cause and effect relationship, arguing that as women have gained more rights and freedoms, Western societies have become more unstable and chaotic. Do you buy that?
I think that's where their argument starts to unravel a bit. They seem to be overlooking all the other factors that have contributed to, social and political change in the West, like economic inequality, globalization, the rise of social media. I mean, these are powerful forces that have undeniably shaped the world we live in.
Totally, yeah. They also don't seem to acknowledge that those traditional gender roles that they hold up as ideal have often been used to justify discrimination and oppression against women.
That's right, yeah.
It's not a coincidence that movements for gender equality have often gone hand in hand with movements for other types of social justice, like the civil rights movement and the fight for LGBTQ plus rights. These are interconnected struggles.
That's a crucial point, and let's not forget that.
Yeah.
The very idea of what counts as traditional gender roles is itself something that's been, shaped by society and has changed over time and across different cultures.
Yeah.
There's no one-size-fits-all definition of what it means to be a man or a woman, and those roles have always been more fluid than the source acknowledges.
So while I find it interesting to consider their perspective, I think we need to approach their claims with a healthy dose of skepticism, right? Because they're offering a pretty simplistic view of some very complex issues, and they're relying on a very selective interpretation of history and sociology to back up their arguments. It's important to remember that.
I absolutely agree. And perhaps most importantly, they seem to be advocating for a return to a past that for many people was inherently unequal and unjust. I think that's a dangerous path to go down.
I agree with you there. Now let's turn our attention to something that I find particularly concerning about their argument, their portrayal of Africa as a model for the West to emulate. They're essentially saying that if the West wants to save itself from collapse, it should look to Africa's adherence to those traditional values and patriarchal structures we talked about earlier. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's where their argument veers into some really tricky territory. They're promoting a form of cultural colonialism, suggesting that Western societies should just adopt the values and practices of another culture without fully understanding the context
or the potential consequences. It's a very oversimplified view of
a complex situation.
And it's important to remember that they're presenting a very idealized and romanticized view of Africa.
Right.
They're glossing over those very real challenges and complexities that exist across the continent, like poverty, corruption, political instability. It's not as idyllic as they make it seem.
Absolutely. And they're also downplaying the very real issues of gender inequality and discrimination that still persist in many African countries to suggest that the West should look to Africa as a model for gender relations is not only misguided,
Yeah.
but it's also deeply insensitive to the struggles that many African women face.
It's also worth noting that they seem to be cherry-picking examples to support their argument. They highlight things like the role of male chiefs and kings in traditional African societies, but conveniently ignore the countless powerful and influential women who have played, crucial roles throughout African history. It's a very selective telling of the story.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they have this romanticized idea of a pre-colonial Africa where those traditional values reigned supreme.
But they're ignoring the fact that pre-colonial Africa also had its own forms of conflict and inequality.
Yes.
Wasn't this perfect utopia they seem to be imagining?
Right. Their portrayal of Africa ends up being a bit of a caricature, a simplistic and reductionist view that completely fails to capture the richness and diversity of the continent.
That's a really good way to put it, yeah. So, while I believe it's important to engage with, different perspectives, it's crucial to do so critically and thoughtfully. And in this case, I think the sources' arguments are based on
a flawed understanding of history, sociology, and culture, and ultimately lead to some pretty dangerous and harmful conclusions. What really concerns me is their romanticized view of Africa and their call for the West to emulate its supposed adherence to traditional values. It's essential to recognize and challenge these kinds of
colonialist
and essentialist arguments whenever we come across them.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. Let's not forget the importance of critical thinking in all of this. When we come across bold claims like the ones presented in the source material, it's our responsibility to ask tough questions, examine the evidence, and consider alternative perspectives. That's what a good depth dive is all about, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not about, blindly accepting what we're told, but about grappling with ideas, even challenging ones in a way that helps us better understand the world around us. That's what we're trying to do here today.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's keep those critical thinking skills sharp. We've unpacked a lot of dense material, but there's always more to explore. In the next part, we'll examine some of the counter-arguments to the source's claims and see if we can develop a more nuanced understanding of gender dynamics, both in the West and in Africa, I think. I think you'll find it quite enlightening. Okay, so as we kind of head into this final part of our deep dive, there's something that's been, nagging at me this whole time.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's how this source portrays Africa. It just feels so simplistic, almost like a caricature, They present this image of a continent that's, frozen in time, untouched by all the, complexities of gender dynamics and social change that we see, everywhere else in the world. It just doesn't ring true to me.
I completely agree. It's like they're trying to fit this vast and diverse continent into a neat little box where, men are always calling the shots and women are just dutifully following tradition.
Yeah.
But the reality, as you said, there's so much more nuance than that.
Yeah, totally. Africa is like a tapestry of cultures and beliefs and experiences, each one unique and constantly evolving. To suggest that there's a single unified African perspective on gender roles is not only inaccurate, it's and incredibly dismissive of the agency and individuality of African people.
Right.
It's like they're denying them the right to define their own identities and experiences.
And let's not forget that feminism has a long and rich history in Africa, dating back to pre-colonial times. I mean, women have always played vital roles in African societies, from leading resistance movements to shaping cultural norms. And they've always been forces to be reckoned with.
Yeah. Think about iconic figures like Ya Asantewaa, the Ashanti queen, who led a war against British colonialism.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or Winnie Mandela, who fought tirelessly against apartheid in South Africa. These women weren't just, sitting on the sidelines. They were active agents of change, challenging patriarchal structures, fighting for women's rights.
And those movements haven't gone away.
Yeah, no.
Across the continent, there are countless women and men working to advance gender equality, combat violence against women, create more just and equitable societies.
Totally.
They're building on the legacies of those who came before them and forging new paths for the future.
It's happening right now all over Africa. And these aren't just Western imports, right?
Yeah.
They're homegrown movements rooted in local contexts. They're addressing specific challenges and drawing on both traditional values and modern ideas to create solutions that work for their communities.
It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot where tradition and progress can coexist.
Yeah.
And even complement each other. It's not about, erasing the past. It's about building a better future that honors the contributions of everyone.
Okay, so we've challenged the sources' rather narrow portrayal of Africa.
Yeah.
But let's also take a moment to revisit their claims about the decline of Western civilization. They seem to be suggesting that the West is like on the brink of collapse because it's embraced feminism and abandoned those traditional values they hold so dear. It's a pretty dire prediction, wouldn't you say?
It is, yeah. It's a familiar refrain, often echoed by those who, fear change and long for a return to a perceived golden age.
Yeah.
But as we've discussed, their argument rests on a pretty shaky foundation. They're, cherry-picking evidence, ignoring the complexities of social change.
They latch on to things like rising divorce rates, the decline of the traditional nuclear family, as if they're, symptoms of some terminal illness.
Yeah.
But these trends are far more complex than they make them seem. They're influenced by a whole web of factors, from the economic pressures to shifting social norms, and they can't simply be blamed on, feminism.
Exactly. And let's not forget that those very changes that they lament have also brought about greater freedom and equality for women. The ability to, leave an unhappy marriage, to pursue an education and a fulfilling career, to have control over one's own body and reproductive choices. These are all significant advancements that have profoundly impacted the lives of countless women.
Absolutely. And while there may be challenges that come with those changes, like navigating new family structures or tackling persistent gender inequalities in the workplace, they're not insurmountable.
Right.
We can address them through, thoughtful policies and open dialogue, not by trying to, rewind the clock.
I think that's the key takeaway here.
Yeah.
Progress is rarely a smooth or linear process.
Right.
There will always be, bumps along the road.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't shy away from acknowledging those challenges, but that doesn't mean we should abandon the pursuit of a more just and equitable society. It just means we need to, keep working at it, keep refining our approaches, and keep listening to the voices of those who are most affected.
Yeah, I love that. It's about finding solutions, not just dwelling on problems. And while this source might paint a rather bleak picture of the West's future,
right,
I think there's room for optimism, Societies evolve, values shift, and progress, even if it's sometimes messy and uneven, continues.
That's beautifully put. And I think that's what makes engaging in these kinds of discussions so vital.
Yeah.
By challenging those outdated assumptions, by questioning those easy answers, and by, really listening to the diverse voices around us. We can create a future that's not just sustainable, but truly inclusive.
Well, I think we've covered an impressive amount of ground in this deep dive.
We have, yeah.
We explored a perspective that was definitely provocative, even a bit unsettling at times.
Right.
We delved into this supposed clash between Western and African values, dissecting those arguments, challenging their assumptions, offering up alternative interpretations. And I think most importantly, we highlighted the importance of, critical thinking, nuanced understanding, and respectful engagement with different cultures and perspectives.
It's about, embracing that complexity, acknowledging the messiness of it all, and resisting the temptation to, oversimplify, I think. I think that's the only way we can truly learn and grow from these conversations.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We hope this deep dive has left you, our listener, with more questions and answers, because that's the beauty of exploration, isn't it?
It is.
It's not about arriving at some definitive conclusion. It's about, opening our minds to new possibilities, challenging our own biases, and keeping the conversation going.
And as you reflect on the ideas we've explored today, we want to leave you with this final thought. How do we move beyond those simplistic narratives of us versus them, of, tradition pitted against modernity, of patriarchy versus equality? How do we build a future where gender isn't a source of, division and oppression?
Right.
But a celebration of our shared humanity.
That's a powerful question. And it's one we all need to grapple with.
We do.
We encourage you to continue the conversation in your own communities and circles. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a truly thought-provoking journey.